Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 193, November 25th to December 1st, 1864. Last week, we talked about another desperate covert operation by the Confederates, an attempt to destroy Manhattan. This would illustrate just how back to the wall the rebels are going to get as we move into 1865. We also covered the unfortunate event of the massacre at Sand Creek. This week, we will fully focus on Alabama and Tennessee. In the process, we will fight really what will become part one of the death knell of the Confederacy, the Battle of Franklin. Before we do that, though, let's talk about our Patreon content, and of course, we have posted several episodes here, some movie reviews in the past. We've also done memoir reviews and picture slideshows of modern-day battlefields. And this month, as we get into December here, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to run down a top 10 list of monuments at the different battlefields around the country. So I will have my personal list, my favorites from the different battlefields. And certainly, if that sounds like it interests you, you want to see some pictures as well, I'll probably include those in the episode. That is all posted on the Patreon. There's a link in the show description. Those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. When we last left off, John Bell Hood had moved through North Georgia and was turning his attention to Alabama. The goal of his command would be to try to protect the interior of the Confederacy by taking out Sherman's supply lines, forcing him to move away from North Georgia. Now, as we know from a previous episode, that does not exactly happen because Sherman is going to be gallivanting through the Peach State with especially no opposition. But where was Hood? Well, remember, he was trying to get into Tennessee, but you see, best case scenario, we can say he was not all that good at organizing and planning. Worst case, he was negligent in actually coming up with a true plan. I've seen several sources basically having these two primary opinions. P.G.T. Beauregard had been sent to serve as theater commander. Really, this was a way in which Jefferson Davis could satisfy everything. Beauregard would be over Richard Taylor and Hood, which would appease the Southern public. However, the fact remained that Davis, for whatever reason, still wanted Hood to be the battlefield leader. Perhaps it was because of a friendship or a familiarity formed in Richmond. Perhaps Bragg was to his ear. But the main problem in this setup is that the Confederate president told him that the Cajun general was his superior only in name, really. As a result, Hood is going to often ignore him, while also hoping he would assist in getting his logistical network together. Now, that is not to say that Hood is given carte blanche. In fact, Davis is going to tell him as much as he meets face-to-face with the former Texas Brigade commander. Now remember also, though, that there is a deficiency in the amount of men who can actually lead an army, and Hood has at least been leading the Army of Tennessee for some time now. Now, the Southern populace is not going to be particularly happy with him because he has not defended Atlanta. He has managed to rack up a large amount of casualties in the process, these kind of ill-advised offensive actions. So getting Beauregard in there as sort of the face to the operation, to the public, it's also going to get rid of Beauregard, and we know that Davis is not a big fan of Beauregard, and because of this action that had occurred in 1864 here in the Virginia theater, right, especially the Bermuda Hundred campaign, Beauregard had been placed in Richmond and the defenses of Richmond, so he is now where Davis doesn't want him, and that's really close to him, right? Really close to the government. And even though Beauregard has kind of these outlandish ideas about how he can combine with Lee or vice versa, and they could destroy one army and then turn their attention to the other, so at least he's coming up with these ideas, Davis is going to want to ship him elsewhere. So this is a good plan for Davis. Get him out of here, right? Beauregard had done a pretty good job in defending Charleston, so it's not like he is without his good performances, but obviously he's a little bit wanting in terms of strategy and command. Interesting figure. Probably will do a more in-depth look at him maybe in a future episode, but for the time being, Davis is going to be satisfied with this. Hood is going to have essentially operational control on the ground. As the Army gets into Tennessee, Beauregard will essentially throw up his hands. Now, if you owned a company and you told a hired employee, hey, you don't have to listen to your manager, well, how well do you think that's going to go over? So while Beauregard is not without his faults, you kind of feel for him in this situation. Again, we can briefly think about who might have been a better option. Hardee, maybe. But at least you kind of get why Hood is seemingly a better choice. He is an aggressive commander, and if nothing else, he fits the desperate nature of the Confederacy now at the back end of the war. But the problem is that even though he is aggressive, Hood will let an opportunity slip by not pouncing on the Federals as they divided their forces. His army is only at some 35,000, a shadow of what it had been earlier. Now, do you think that having stretched the supply lines very thin, it might have been a good idea for him to chase after Sherman? At least he might have been able to dissuade the march to the sea from reaching its final destination, or at least might have given Sherman a black eye before he got there. Either way. But the fact was, he is too far away to stop Sherman, which you can think might have been a problem in the eyes of the Confederate government. So that goes back to the point of exactly what is the plan. To answer that, we will need to unroll the events as we get into the winter. Remember, there had been some successes in northern Georgia by Hood. It had sort of received the attention of Sherman, who had actually shifted his forces in the general vicinity, kind of chasing after Hood, but really a lackadaisical effort. From there, Hood would seek to cross the Tennessee River. He will continually see garrisons, which, while smaller, are going to be well entrenched. By this point in the war, the Army of Tennessee will be seeing a similar attitude to that of the Army of the Potomac. Attacking heavy earthworks that are well defended is no longer going to be something that troops are going to be willing to partake in. So Hood has a problem. He would turn his attention to Guntersville and Decatur to try to cross. Guntersville would see the issue of Union gunboats that might have otherwise destroyed Hood's army as it crossed the river. Decatur was more lightly defended, so Hood is going to keep trekking west. But Decatur would be held by some 5,000 men. Robert Granger would hold command in northern Alabama here. He would try to funnel reinforcements while Hood demonstrated. A charge would be conducted by the 14th United States Colored Troops as part of the skirmishing, the regiment performing well and gaining the admiration of their white comrades. What was clear was that the Confederates would need to find an alternative, one not so heavily defended. Some 150 Union troops would be casualties compared to 450 during this stage. Florence, Alabama was deemed to be the better crossing point, the army moving to Tuscumbia on the southern side of the river. From there, the Confederates were protected from the Union gunboats by a position at Muscle Shoals, so this was a good spot, seemingly. S.D. Lee's troops would cross and take Florence in late October, early November, but there they would sit. You see, Beauregard was constantly being told that Hood was moving and adjusting the base of supply. This would frustrate the commander, who often did not know where his supposed subordinate was. In the meantime, Sherman is going to shove off, burning Atlanta and getting into Georgia proper. So far away, Hood would simply have to keep going. But getting enough rations to move was also a problem, the lines of supply being very shaky. It will be here where some of the captured United States Colored Troops were pressed into service repairing a railroad, something that P.G. Beauregard would be angered by. In the meantime, the Union forces were allowed to start to put things together. David Stanley and elements of Schofield were forming up. Schofield would be the commander in the field for the Union Army. The 4th Corps of Stanley would have some familiar faces in division command: Thomas Wood, who was still trying to redeem himself from Chickamauga, Nathan Kimball, who has bounced around a little bit, and George Wagner, who has been in the sub-theater for quite some time. Kimball has brigades under Isaac Kirby, Walter Whitaker, and William Groves. Wagner has Emerson Opdyke, John Quincy Lane, and Joseph Conrad in brigade command, while Wood has Abel Strait commanding infantry instead of Jackass cavalry, if you recall, Sidney Post, and Joseph Knepfler. J. Cox would take command of the 18th Corps with divisions under Thomas Ruger, who you might remember from Gettysburg, and James Riley, who was an Ohio politician serving since the Knoxville campaign. James Wilson is going to have cavalry command, him with divisions under Edward Hatch, Edward McCook, and Richard Johnson, all previously mentioned serving in the West. A.J. Smith's men were also supposedly on the way for Thomas, who was at Nashville hoping that Hood might follow Sherman instead. He would receive reports to the opposite, Forrest's cavalry joining Hood to make for a stronger mounted arm prior to the invasion. Indeed, Forrest was going to start to raid in Tennessee to disrupt operations there. November 21st would mark the day in which Hood's army in icy conditions would start to move north. The plan would be to try to eliminate Schofield and then deal with Thomas. Schofield was currently at Pulaski, a little to the north and east. Really, he would rather have been behind the Duck River, close to Franklin, in the beginning of the outskirts of Nashville. The three corps of the Confederates would each take separate routes as they marched north. In the meantime, Forrest's cavalry would victimize their Union counterparts under Hatch and Croxton. Many of the good cavalry regiments had been stripped to join Kilpatrick and his command as they rode with Sherman. Some of the units that Forrest was facing were actually armed with muzzle-loading Springfields, a weapon more commonly used for infantry than that of cavalry, who would be more likely armed with breech-loaders or carbine-type weapons. Keep that in mind as we move forward, as well as that the cavalry is limited in the West, so you don't really hear a whole lot about cavalry. It's a little bit more limited than, say, the East. And there will be this emphasis on trying to get the cavalry in this sector up to snuff, right? So the more veteran regiments have gone with Kilpatrick and the raid into Georgia. It's another thing that Sherman's kind of criticized of, is that he takes supposedly the best units with him and then just completely disregards this Confederate army as it starts its operations. Forrest would easily swat these men away, adding to his legend, charging into an enemy camp with only his bodyguard. Now, it was deemed that Columbia, Tennessee was going to be a key location, as Hood would cut off Schofield at Pulaski. Union infantry would win the race to this town, dissuading Confederate cavalry from continuing. Columbia was going to be a tough sell for Schofield, who would realize his back was still to the Duck River, which meant he would pull back beyond that waterway, allowing for the Confederates to enter the town. Several Confederate sources would write about how this town had been spared by war. In fact, Columbia was where Forrest had almost been assassinated, if you recall, but this would be a big difference in Hood versus Sherman. Sherman's march to the sea would be through country that had not yet been touched by war, and so the troops would live relatively comfortably, albeit they are foraging. With this exception, Hood's army would be marching into a state that had already been ravaged by war several times. But speaking of Sherman, Hood would have the opportunity at this time to implement some of the same tactics that Kump had unleashed on the rebels on the road to Atlanta. He would make a show of perhaps assaulting the enemy at Columbia, but really focus on sending A.P. Stewart and Cheatham to flank the Union troops. Through a gaffe in the plan for James Wilson and his cavalry, Forrest had been able to find and hold a crossing of the Duck River. Hood could get around to the east and cut off the Union forces, essentially cutting them in half. This movement started on the 28th and would see the best opportunity for Hood to actually make a difference in this theater. Union forces would find themselves at a place called Spring Hill, and there begin skirmishing with Forrest's cavalry on the 29th. Spring Hill was where Earl Van Dorn had been killed, so it's been in our story before. In November of 1864, it would be important as it sat along the Columbia Pike, control of which would be crucial, seeing as Schofield still had a majority of his command to the south. Forrest troopers were tired and running low on ammunition, especially facing repeating carbines and eventually Federal infantry, but he did capture a courier that spelled out that Schofield was still south and Stanley north, meaning that the army was indeed divided. Spring Hill would see members of the 4th Corps arrive, Opdyke and Luther Bradley's brigades beginning to deploy. Forrest would still believe he was just facing cavalry, but would be proven wrong. Cheatham's corps would be necessary to dislodge the enemy. Pat Cleburne would deploy his division with orders to seize the turnpike, but he would run into troops under Luther Bradley. Bradley would force Cleburne to turn and deal with him, causing there to be a shift away from the primary objective, Bradley being wounded in the process. Cleburne would be stopped by artillery forming up from the 4th Corps. Cheatham's other commands would be given orders essentially to support Cleburne, but there was confusion as Hood had waylaid Bate and Claiborne and given them different orders without informing Cheatham. Then the commanding general would retire, reportedly to rest, and then also reportedly take some laudanum. Hood would attempt to get Bate moving toward the real objective, but with daylight slipping away, all would fall into confusion. There was a mix between do they attack and take Spring Hill, or simply form up on the Columbia Pike, therefore blocking and cutting off Schofield. As a result, neither was accomplished. A renewal of the assault would be planned out with Brown's division, but Brown halted as there had been part of the 4th Corps redeploying to threaten his flank. Without support on his flank, he would pause. Allegheny Johnson would request to try to take the pike, but would be denied as darkness had not proven good for operations at Chickamauga for the veterans of the Army of Tennessee. Thus, the 18th Corps coming up from the south would be allowed to slip by the rebels. There are accounts of just how close the Federals are as they march past the Confederates. Some Federals who are on the pike see fires off to the side and they actually walk up and they immediately get captured by Confederates. That's how close they are in some cases. So that illustrates you just how confused this action was. The Union troops are marching right on by. The Confederates are essentially just sleeping there as they do that. What could have been a real opportunity for Hood would result in 500 Confederate losses compared to 350 Federals, and not really a whole lot to show for it. At this point in the war, it's a small battle, but with great significance on the events to come. The controversy over Spring Hill, however, is that Frank Cheatham was given one direction by Hood, and then Hood ordered Cleburne and Bate to adjust their battle plans without telling the Corps commander. Cheatham reined in Bate, who might have been able to accomplish the task given to him. Officers would visit Hood at his headquarters, but Hood probably did not understand what the situation was on the ground. He would blame all the officers involved, and crucially too, call into question the bravery of the rank and file. A big no-no if you want to maintain morale. Nathan Bedford Forrest reportedly threatens to kill Hood in this encounter, but added the caveat that if he was not half a man, referring to Hood's missing leg and lame arm. So you do have to kind of feel for Hood. He's actually been wounded very severely 2 times, and it's probably part of the reason why he's taken laudanum. Campaigning is not going to be agreeing with him as it probably once had earlier in the war. So he's a little bit of a changed battlefield commander, and certainly outside of his depth as army commander in this case. The night of the 29th, Schofield's men would shuffle on by the Confederates. A major opportunity would be lost by the rebels. Hood would not forgive Cheatham's corps for the slight of having failed him, and in spite of being the less than efficient route, would move them to be slated for a grand assault. Schofield would be happy and extremely lucky that he had been able to extricate his forces. As far as he was concerned, however, the job was not done. The Harpeth River sat between him and his final safety, the defenses at Nashville. Disappointingly for Schofield, though, Thomas was not going to let him quickly escape. He would command him to delay Hood, if possible, right where he was at Franklin. A.J. Smith, remember, is still arriving. There is still a division from his corps that is on the way there, so he's not going to be able to add the full force of those veterans to the command. Schofield, though, is going to realize that he is going to have a tough time of delaying Hood. His troops had begun to dig in around a farmhouse owned by a man named Carter, this position being the apex in a kind of crescent moon-shaped defense facing north. He would argue his position could be flanked rather easily, but Thomas was really focused on buying at least a day. Jacob Cox would do an excellent job in building the defensive works. He would describe the battlefield. Looking northward toward the town, a well-marked slope leads to a lower level on which the place is built. The public square, in its center being 40 feet lower than the knoll or bench at the Carter House. The pretty village itself is a third of a mile away, an open belt of fields and gardens then encircling it from the river to the river as it stands, in the deep re-entrant angle of the Harpeth. The bend of the river is almost a right angle, and the stream washes the east and north sides of the town. As one goes up the stream, he finds, after getting beyond the houses, that the valley turns to the southeast, but downstream it trends to the northwest, which is the general course of the river, till it falls into the Cumberland, some 30 miles away. In the re-entrant angle, the northerly bank is the commanding one, being not only of a higher general level, but having also well-marked hills, and one of which, Figures Hill, infiltrating the stream and railway on the eastern side of the river, was Fort Granger, a dismantled earthwork built a year or two before. The railway bridge is perfectly covered by an artillery placed in the fort, and deep cut in the railway at the edge of the town may also be thoroughly swept from that position. The streets in the town are not in the same direction as the turnpike at the Carter House. When the highway from Columbia enters the village, it turns to the right to reach a favorable place at the river for the bridge, and the squares are symmetrical with this line. The turnpike bridge had been destroyed early in the war and had not yet been rebuilt. It was a single span of covered wooden truss, resting on high abutments. What was in 1864 known as the County Bridge was a lower and cheaper structure on trestles, built near the railway crossing, where a hollow on the north side made a practicable ascent of the river. This departure from the straight line of the turnpike added nearly half a mile to the length of the road, besides making it more difficult by reason of the grades. The ford was between the side of the former turnpike bridge and the county bridge. From the Carter House, though, the village to the ford is about a mile, turning now to the south. From the same point of view, it is seen that the Columbia Turnpike is nearly level, rising slightly till it crosses a low summit half a mile distant, and then dipping again, so as to hide men or teams in the road. Most of the space to the Winstead Hill, 2 miles away, is so gently undulating as to look like a plain with a few depressions on it, on right and left of the central ridge and road, where small watercourses run either way to the Harpeth. About half a mile to Winstead Hill, a bold, stony hill rises on the west of the turnpike, isolated in the general level around it, and known in the neighborhood as Privet Knob. Winstead Hill bounds the valley on the south, making part of a circle of ridges and heights, which seem to surround the basin in which the town lies. The Columbia Turnpike rises straight south, lost to view after it passes the low summit above mentioned, but coming into view again, climbing Winstead Hill by a white line rising from left to right, and passing over the crest between two of the rounded summits, which give the elevation a picturesque outline. Two other turnpikes run from the town southward. That to Louisburg goes up the Harpeth Valley in a southeasterly direction. The other is at the west, and leaves the town by a similar angle. It is called the Carter's Creek Turnpike. The map of Franklin and its surrounding had been aptly compared to the left hand, and extended with separated fingers. The little finger and the thumb at right angles represent the Harpeth River, in its course from left to right, whilst the three fingers spread in the midst indicate the three turnpikes diverging southward from the village, half a mile southwest of the Carter House, and near the Carter's Creek Turnpike, is a hillock with a mansion and orchard known as the Bostic Place. Between the two houses is a gentle hollow, which is about 30 feet above the level in which direct line from house to house. In it heads a small watercourse, which meanders through it, and crossing the Carter's Creek Turnpike, curves northwardly to the Harpeth. This hollow, with its marshy brook, bounds the village on the west. Looking eastward, the Carter Hill went forward a little, and one then saw, 120 yards in front and 80 yards east of the turnpike, a cotton gin, a strong frame building like a barn on the most advanced salient of the hill. To the left, this was the ground descended a little, but rose again on reaching the Louisburg Turnpike, half a mile away, where between it and the railroad, and a little in the rear, was another well-marked knoll, through which the railway excavation cuts, as has been already mentioned. Beyond the knoll and the railroad was the upper reach of the river, winding the field in front as it bore off to the eastward. Such was the field as it lay before us, under the level beams of the rising sun. It was evident that the Carter Hill was the key to any strong system of defense in front of the town. So it is a very long description, but it does describe very well exactly what we're looking at in terms of the battlefield. The parts that we probably should point out, though, is that there's this big plain. A little foreshadowing here. There's a wide open plain that is going to be leading toward the Carter House, right? And then we also have the river. That's going to be a big part of the action here to come. It's on kind of two sides of the town, so it is a major obstacle. Fort Granger would be occupied by federal artillery, key to the action, as they would have a clear field of fire. In fact, Hood's artillery was still lagging, and he only has 2 batteries to support the assault. In many cases, soldiers would write about how open the country was, making the assault an impressive sight, as you could see everything. Additionally, artillery had high ground behind the main earthworks, who were also protected by sharp bushes cut from beside the pike, and in some places could fire through gaps. George D. Wagner, in the meantime, would be leading the rearguard effort. The Confederates were nipping at the heels of their enemy on the 30th. Emerson Opdyke and his brigade would be ordered to halt and set up in advance of the main Union line. This would cause a great argument between Opdyke and Wagner, Opdyke continuing on to a reserve position. Wagner would call out, "Well, Opdyke, you just fight where you please. We all know you'll fight." Opdyke had a temper and often had to apologize for his outbursts. But he did have a point. His brigade, along with Whitaker's, had skirmished with Forrest's cavalry at Breezy Hill, falling back to a better defensive position, but still in advance of the main Union line. With Lane's and Conrad's brigades, Wagner would form a line and instruct the sergeants to fix bayonets to keep the men where they were. Jacob Cox would be okay with Opdyke moving beyond the Fountain Carter House, as he was still under the impression that they would soon be evacuating to beyond the Harpeth River. That just goes to show you it's very rare that you want to fight with your back to the river. It's something that wants to be avoided, but if you're a Civil War general, very rare that happens, but here we have one of those cases. In the meantime, Hood would arrive and survey the Union lines. He would see the hastily thrown together earthworks and the fact that the Northerners were trying to get across the river. As a result, he would order an all-out assault, with Cheatham's men leading the way. Pat Claiborne had already viewed the line and declared them quite formidable, but it would be Claiborne and Brown leading the way, the two who in Hood's mind had failed him at Spring Hill. Forrest would ask for infantry and offer to flank the enemy with his cavalry and added support, but this was declined. Now Hood might have been better off with a flanking maneuver, but he was seeing the enemy run, and he had just seen an opportunity slip between his fingers, so it's not without reason, we can say perhaps, that this could have been the right call. His flank maneuver before had not been carried out, and all along the way there had been discarded supplies to the enemy and civilians, saying that the rebels had the enemy on the run. Dutifully, the generals would prepare for a frontal assault. They would have to prove to their commanding general that they were not afraid to attack earthworks head-on. Daniel Govan would remark to Claiborne that not many of them would make it back to Arkansas. Claiborne would reply, "If we are going to die, let us die like men." Cheatham would take the west side of the pike and Stewart on the left. In the waning hours of the 30th, the rebels would begin to form up. Members of the 20th Tennessee would attempt to give valuables to the regimental chaplain, who would decline, saying that he was going to go in with them. French's small command would align to the east of the pike, supported by Walthall and Loring, hoping to smash the Union line closest to the Harpeth River. Claiborne would be down the middle along the pike. As the bands played Dixie and Bonnie Blue Flag, the attack would jump off, Francis Cockrell leading his Missouri Brigade forward. Claudius Sears and his Mississippi men would break and hit the advance elements of Wagner's brigades, meaning that Cockrell, advancing well ahead of Walthall, was alone. Shells began to come in from various Union artillery, pouring fire into what many would write had been awe-inspiring, as the Gray and Byrna troops came forward. Cockrell would go down wounded, a horse being shot from under him. Every member of his staff would be killed or wounded, as would the next 2 commanders of the Missouri Brigade, finally making it to the Federal line, part of which was manned by a unit with Henry repeaters. They would huddle into the ditch before the Union works, holding onto the ground they had gained at such a great cost. Walthall and Loring on the Confederate right would soon join French's command, slammed into the wall of the Union earthworks. They would have a terrible time getting through the rough terrain, and then on to the earthworks beyond, through thorny bushes. One Confederate would write, "We had worked our way through this thorny obstruction under a heavy fire and formed in front when the order was given to fix bayonets and charge. Our color sergeant with the flag was by my side when the order came. All of the color guard, 9 in number, had been shot. As the bearer fell in the desperate charge, he handed me the flag. I took it with misgivings, feeling that I should be shot. But I could not refuse to take it. I, with the flag in my hand, rushed to the breastworks to plant the flag on their works." There are reports that there were all kinds of small thorny bushes that had lined the pike, and so the Union troops are actually able to kind of cut these and make this sort of pseudo abattis kind of defense for their earthworks, which are actually, again, pretty well laid out by Jacob Cox. He does a really good job in putting together this defensive line. Small arms, along with artillery, would rip through the Confederate ranks. Thomas Scott of Loring's command would be wounded in the attack, and William Quarles of Walthall's command likewise would have to be removed from the action. John Adams, commanding the Magnolia Staters in Loring's division, would steer his men toward the Carter cotton gin and try to support Cleburne's attack as best he could. Adams would remain mounted, the Union soldiers actually writing of the sight of his bravery before he was riddled with bullets, killing him. The rest of the Confederates would cling to the earthworks, firing or bayoneting through the headlogs. Some would try to push on out, but were mowed down. A Federal officer would write, "Defiantly moved on until they struck the hedge, where they were balked as completely as though they had run against a Chinese wall. They made desperate efforts to penetrate it without avail. Human nature couldn't stand the destructive fire that was rained upon them, and they began to move quickly by the flank, so as to pass around the hedge. When they reached the road, they tried to force an entrance through the brush that had been cut down. Seeing their exertions, I directed the fire of 2 companies full upon them, right down the road, and they were compelled to flank again. Having passed the brush, they came back in on one grand rush. One color bearer sprang upon the works and was instantly shot. Another color bearer was shot in front of the companies, A and F. Their field officers and several captains were either killed or wounded, and they broke and fled in confusion. It was a terrible assault, and most terribly it was punished." In the center, Cleburne had been instructed not to have his men fire until the Union picket line had been scattered. He prepared his brigade to attack straight down toward the cotton gin on the east side of the pike. John C. Brown would hit the Carter House proper on the west side. Both would form their brigades more into column. Cleburne with Granbury's Texans and Govan's Arkansas troops, followed by Lowry's Mississippi men. Brown would have Gist and Gordon attack with John Carter and Arthur Strahl behind. George Gordon would remind the Tennessee troops that they must not be outdone by Granbury's Texans. They would rumble forward toward Wagner's men, who had pleaded with their officers to allow them back to the main Federal line. They would fire in the ways of Confederates, but with both flanks threatened and the mass of humanity coming forward, they would start to break. One officer wrote that he told his men to retreat and then demonstrated for them how to do it. An Arkansas soldier would write, "The Yankees opened fire on us from beyond their entrenchments and were first killing and wounding our men. My color bearer was shot, and the flag fell across my pathway. I picked up the flag, and as I unfurled it to the breeze, Colonel P.V. Green, who had gone into the fight on foot, grasped the flag and said in his familiar way, 'Damn, I'll carry the flag. Look after your own company.' They were killing and wounding our men so fast, and the order to charge was given. We raised the rebel yell and moved in quick time, but before we reached the works, the Yankees fled in disorder. Our boys emptied their loaded guns into the confused ranks of the fleeing troops. I noticed General Cleburne, the gallant old hero, with his hat in his hand waving above his head, scaled the earthworks from which we had routed the Yankees. I could not hear what he was saying, but knew he meant to go forward. Again we raised the rebel yell and renewed the charge. As Wagner's men retreated, there was a problem for the main Union line. They could not open fire while their comrades were on their front. The Confederates would actually realize this and attempt to run into the works with them, and although the defenders were able to get off a few shots, Confederates of Brown's division broke into the battle line. They would even get beyond a second line of defenses, some of the Federals starting to form a defense in the yards of the Carter House itself. Granbury would fall with a shot to the head on the other side of the pike. Claiborne would have his horse killed from under him, one and then another torn in half by a cannonball. His men would smash into the works, hand-to-hand fighting ensuing. Captured Federals would need to lie prone in the ditch to avoid being shot by the whizzing bullets that were still flying from all around. The rebels would capture some pieces of artillery, but the Federals would hold. Lowry would write that his men would fight the enemy from across the parapet. The 104th Ohio, the Barking Dog Regiment, named as such due to their mascot, would fight hard here, part of James Riley's division. A member of that regiment would write that the enemy's loss was so great that one could not walk without stepping on them. Claiborne's men would add to the weight now getting to the Carter buildings. Lines of reserve were called upon, one Union eyewitness writing of the artillery. The two former were in command of Riley's second line and had been cautioned by General Cox to look out for a break at this point, and when it did come, they were ready. They did not wait for an order, but sprang over the low rifle pits like tigers, and with a shrill shout that was heard even above the rebel yell, and heroism rarely equaled by men, went pell-mell into the mass of the Confederates that had taken our line, and did not know what to do with it. At the same time, Charlie Scoville cracked his black snake whip about his ears of his artillerymen and drove them back to the guns, as they went with pickaxes and shovels, slashing all around them with the ferocity of demons. Now remember that Emerson Opdyke had declined being part of George Day Wagner's initial battle line. Instead, he had moved his brigade beyond the Carter House. Well, it was time for him to now enter the fray. Trying to get his command at the Confederates in an orderly fashion, Major Thomas Motherspaugh of the 73rd Illinois would order his men to charge, breaking the cohesion, but also throwing the Union troops at the gray mass, breaking the center of the line. Motherspaugh would soon fall mortally wounded, but the rest of the brigade would charge from beyond the Carter House and into the rebels, in some places fighting around the Carter House itself. In this action of Opdyke's command, there would be the 24th Wisconsin, the 24th being commanded by Major Arthur MacArthur, who is going to be wounded in the melee but survive. This is actually going to be the father of Douglas MacArthur. General Stanley would be wounded riding in with Opdyke's men. Many wrote of the savage nature of the fighting, bayonets and club muskets being used to push the Confederates back to the main line of works. A soldier wrote that he saw an officer in his regiment with a hatchet in one hand and his revolver in the other. Opdyke himself was reportedly in the fray, using a clubbed firearm. At one point, he would almost club the brains out of a sergeant he thought was retreating. Artillerymen would write that at each canister shot, you could hear the shot itself, and then the bones. States' Rights Gist would be killed, urging his men forward on foot, having his force shot from under him. John C. Carter was mortally wounded in the fighting. Gordon would write, "The fatality to us as we crouched and fought in the ditch became so great, from these three fires front, left, and rear, that some of the men shouted to the enemy across the line that if they would cease firing, they would surrender. Amid the uproar, this was not heard, and a signal of surrender was made by putting our caps on their bayonets, fixed on their guns, and holding them above the works. The first of these signals that were seen were perforated by enemy's bullets. I suppose they thought it was our heads, or they did not even know what it meant. At length, however, they heard and understood our men, and amid the fearful din, we distinctly heard the command cease firing, given on the other side of the works, and in a moment more, all was comparatively quiet in our immediate front, and the men walked over the works and surrendered. It was fatal to leave the ditch and attempt to escape in the rear. Every man who attempted it, a number who did, were at once shot. I ordered them to remain in the ditch until I told them they could surrender. When all had walked over the works, except one of my men and myself, he asked if I was not going over. I replied in the negative, saying that I would remain under cover of the dead in the ditch until night, which was approaching. He said he would remain with me. But the bullets from our rear, and the enfilading fire on our left, which had never ceased, fell so thickly about us, and I finally said, "We shall be killed if we remain here," at the same time handing him a white handkerchief and telling him to put it on his bayonet and walk over the works. He did so, and I followed him. Now, this is very reminiscent of some of the combat that we saw at Spotsylvania. It's very brutal fighting there, very close on each sides of an earthwork, right? You're firing through headlogs, over the works, right? Bayoneting through wherever you can get at the enemy. There's a lot of very vivid firsthand accounts of this action from both sides, from both Union and Confederate, talking about just how savage this fighting was and just how primal that the Confederates would become, kind of packed into this mass of men in this ditch and facing death from all different directions. It's very hard sometimes to read, and it's very hard to understand. Even these battle-hardened troops start to kind of lose their composure, lose their cool in such just an intense environment. The Confederates would cling to the ditch and fight over the parapet of the enemy. One soldier would ride up Otho Strahl, who would load muskets for his men and pass them forward. We fired at the flash of each other's guns. Holding the enemy's lines, as we continued to do on this part of them, we were terribly massacred by the enfilading fire. The troops were so high that those who fired their guns were obliged to get a footing in the embankment, exposing themselves in addition to their flank, to fire by men in the houses. One especially severe was from Mr. Carter's, immediately in my front. I was near General Strahl, who stood in the ditch and handed up guns to those posted to fire them. The man who had been firing cocked it and was taking deliberate aim, when he was shot and tumbled down, dead into the ditch, upon those killed before him. When the men so exposed were shot down, their places were supplied by volunteers, until these were exhausted, and it was necessary for General Strahl to call upon others. He turned to me, and though I was several feet back from the ditch, I rose up immediately, walking over the wounded and the dead, took position with one foot upon the piled bodies of my dead fellows, and the other on the embankment, and fired guns, which the general himself handed up to me, until he too was shot down. One other man had position on my right, and assisted in the firing. The battle lasted until not an efficient man was left between us and the Columbia Pike, about 50 yards to our right, and hardly enough behind us to hand up the guns. We could not hold out much longer, for indeed, but few of us were left alive. It seemed as if we had no choice but to surrender, or to try to get away, and when we asked the general for counsel, he simply answered, "Keep firing." A grim sense of resolution set in then among the men along the lines. Though many of them knew that the fighting kept on, many of them would not make it till dawn. Indeed, a few minutes after Cunningham spoke, General Strahl was wounded again, and then, while being carried to the rear, he was struck a third time and killed. While the battle became fierce and raged in the center, Bate would throw his command against Ruger on the Confederate left. In this sector, there was a locust grove, including a little swampy terrain. The 108th Third Ohio, a rookie regiment, would do work in repulsing this attack. Their commanding officer would rally them, being mortally wounded in the process. In this assault would ride a young staff officer named Captain Todd Carter. It was the house of his father who the Confederates were attacking. Carter would be hit 9 times, falling on the ground of his family home. Part of the Federal line would be able to enfilade the Confederates, something that was happening all across the defensive front. Allegheny Johnson would try to assault in the dark, S.D. Lee's men forming up behind him, but this too would be ill-advised and just add to the casualties suffered by the Confederates. Johnson's command would partially attack in the Locust Grove sector and partially in the center of the line along the pike, but they would have to charge over their own men, the bodies stacking very high at this point. One harrowing account stated that the ditch there was a wounded officer hit in the neck. So packed was the ditch that the officer could not move, and before he bled out and died, there were soldiers sitting or standing on his dying body. Cox would urge Schofield to go on the offensive and try to finish off the victory, but Schofield would withdraw in the night, and the Battle of Franklin would come to a close. Hood would call the Battle a victory, stating that the enemy had withdrawn, but an inspection of the battlefield would see perhaps the textbook definition of a Pyrrhic victory. One Arkansas soldier would write, W.M. Menton, a member of my company and myself, started out to hunt for our dead, as well as such of our wounded comrades who had been unable to leave the field. We soon became separated, however. I looked around for Minton, and failing to see him, procured other help, and carried the man back to our field hospital, which was located something like a mile south of the battleground. Returning to the field, I met Minton with another one of our wounded boys, who, upon my inquiry as to identity, told me that just after our separation, he and some others, who, like ourselves, were looking for comrades, had found General Claiborne's body. To my further inquiries, he told me the general, when found, was lying on his face just inside the enemy's works, and shot through the body. His pockets were turned the wrong side out, and his boots and sword were gone. Soon after this, Minton pointed out to me that the precise spot on which the general bodies lay. This, as I have said, was just inside the works, and as I now remember it, some 20 or 30 feet east of the line drawn due south from the southeast center of the old gin house. It was accepted opinion of everyone there at the time that he was killed on top of the works, and either fallen or been pulled over inside. While standing at this point, I remember well being shown the position of his head and feet, when found, and the pool of blood for which it flowed, carried with it the life of our beloved, our brave, and matchless general. Pat Clayborne, the Stonewall of the West, was amongst 6 generals killed mortally or outright during the fighting. 8 more general officers were wounded on part of the Confederates. I've often seen speculation of what would have happened if Clayborne had been promoted to higher command. Having written his famous petition early in 1864, this had sealed his fate toward corps command or beyond, however. As it was, he had proven in many battles to be a superior battlefield leader to many of our officers. On the field of battle, Hood would report his losses as maybe 4,500, but it is almost certainly north of that, almost 8,000. Union losses were far less, reportedly in the range of 2,400. Soldiers would write about the great carnage they had seen that day, including Sam Watkins of the 1st Tennessee. One would write that in his 3 years of service, he had never saw anything like it. Hood would reportedly observe the battlefield and openly weep, just as he had done at Gaines's Mill. With that, we will bring the Battle of Franklin to a close. Hood is going to move his army north, where in just 2 episodes' time, we will see the final destiny of the Army of Tennessee. Next week, though, we'll take a short break and look elsewhere. We'll talk about Salmon Chase and his appointment as Chief Justice, and also read some of the accounts of the holidays and how different they were now that we are in 1864. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns, the email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.